6 Unbelievable Stories of Karma and Justice. Story 1. My mother and sister tried to ruin my wedding. Some betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who are supposed to love you the most. Growing up, I always knew my mother had a favorite. My sister, Ellie, was everything she wanted in a daughter. Beautiful, charming, and, most importantly, focused on catching the right man. I, on the other hand, was different. I threw myself into sports, worked hard in school, and eventually won a scholarship to pursue my dream career. Instead of being proud, my mother was disappointed. She thought I was wasting my time, while Ellie was doing exactly what a woman should do, ensuring she had a man to provide for her. Our childhood was shaped by this imbalance. While Ellie was taught how to perfect her smile and flutter her eyelashes, I was left to fend for myself. My mother saw me as secondary, a backup plan, someone who would never be as desirable as Ellie. But I didn't care. I had goals, and I refused to be reduced to a trophy for someone else. Years later, when I met my fiancé, Lucas, I thought things would be different. He loved me for who I was, my ambition, my passion, my strength. When I introduced him to my family, I expected at least a little happiness from my mother. Instead, her reaction left me speechless. She was thrilled, but not for me. She openly suggested that Lucas would be a better match for Ellie. At first, I thought I misheard, but she repeated it, right in front of him. Ellie is more suited for a man like this, she said, as if I wasn't even in the room. Ellie giggled, playing along, as if my relationship was nothing but a joke. Lucas, to his credit, shut it down immediately, making it clear that he loved me. But the damage was already done. I distanced myself, hoping they'd let it go. But they didn't. The morning of my wedding should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, my mother and Ellie stormed into the bridal suite, demanding that I do the right thing and give up Lucas. You don't deserve him, my mother hissed. Ellie would make a real wife. Ellie, standing beside her, looked almost smug, as if she had already won. I felt my heart shatter, but I refused to back down. I told him to leave, but my mother wasn't finished. She stormed into the ceremony, humiliating me in front of my guests. She compared me to Ellie, loudly, cruelly, telling everyone that Ellie was the real beauty of the family, the one who should be standing at the altar, not me. I braced myself for the worst, but then Lucas did something that made my heart swell. He stood beside me, turned to my mother, and declared in front of everyone, I love her, no one else. With those words, my mother's power over me crumbled. They left in a rage, and I knew then that our relationship was beyond repair. After that day, I made a choice. I cut contact with my mother and Ellie. I refused to let their toxicity poison my new life. Of course, Ellie wasn't finished. She spread lies online, portraying me as the villain, twisting the truth to make herself the victim. My father and his side of the family stood by me, but my mother's relatives took her side, believing her version of the story. Eventually, I did the only thing I could. I blocked them both. I chose peace over toxic family ties. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Because real family isn't about blood. It's about who stands beside you when the world turns against you. Story 2. My entitled sister took advantage of me. I was done being her ATM. Family is supposed to support each other. But what happens when they see you as nothing more than a walking wallet? I never thought I would be the kind of person to cut off my own family. But when you give and give until there's nothing left of you, sometimes walking away is the only choice. This is the story of how my sister, Lauren, took advantage of me for years, until I finally had enough. I grew up in a household where responsibility was never equally divided. My parents saw me as the reliable one, the mature, hard-working, and responsible child. Lauren? She was the golden girl, the one who could do no wrong. So when she got into college, my parents didn't worry about how to pay for it. No, that responsibility silently fell onto me. At first, I didn't mind. She was my sister, and I wanted to help. I picked up a second job, working myself to exhaustion just to make sure she had everything she needed. Her tuition, rent, food, books. But soon, it became clear that I wasn't just helping her. I was funding her entire lifestyle. Lauren never once acknowledged the sacrifices I made. While I worked grueling shifts, she was out partying, flaunting designer bags, getting her nails done, and going on expensive weekend getaways with her friends. She wasn't struggling. She was thriving on my dime. And my parents? They acted like this was normal. Anytime I brought up how hard it was for me, my mom would just sigh and say, she's younger. She needs help. You're her older sibling. It's your duty. Then, one day, Lauren came to me with another request. I want to study abroad for a semester. You'll cover it, right? She didn't ask. She expected me to say yes. I finally snapped. I told her no for the first time in years. I wasn't going to send her on some luxurious European vacation while I could barely afford my own rent. But Lauren didn't take rejection well. That night at dinner, she openly mocked me in front of our family. Look at you, working yourself to death. You'll never be more than a loser. I felt my blood boil. After everything I had done for her, she had the audacity to insult me? I pushed my chair back, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "You're on your own now." Then I walked out. At first, my parents didn't believe I was serious. They thought I'd cool off and go back to supporting her like nothing happened. But when Lauren's rent bounced the next month, she panicked. She called me, voice trembling, saying she had nowhere to turn. She even tried apologizing, acting like she regretted what she said. I could hear the desperation in her voice. But I was done. "Figured out," I said. And then I hung up. Without my financial support, her entire world crumbled. The designer bags, the expensive dinners, the nights out, they all disappeared overnight. She had to move back home with our parents, and for the first time in her life, she had to face the consequences of her own actions. My parents, of course, weren't happy. They tried every trick in the book to guilt-trip me. They called me selfish, cold-hearted, ungrateful. But I didn't budge. For years, I had put their needs above my own. Now it was my turn to live for me. Without them draining me dry, I finally had enough money to focus on my own future. I saved up, moved into a better apartment, and even treated myself to things I had never been able to afford before. I felt free. Lauren, on the other hand, she had to adjust to a very different life. She went from living in luxury to scraping by. I heard from mutual friends that she finally had to get a job, her first job ever, and she hated it. My parents were struggling too. Turns out, they had been depending on my money just as much as she had. But I didn't care. I wasn't their personal ATM anymore. Because family or not, no one has the right to use you. Story 3. My parents ostracized me over an inheritance. Family is supposed to be about love, trust, and support. But when money is involved, even the closest bonds can shatter. I never imagined that an inheritance would turn my own parents and sister against me. But it did, and in the ugliest way possible. Growing up, I always had a special bond with my grandfather. He was the only one in my family who truly believed in me. While my parents doted on my younger sister, Olivia, and made it clear she was their favorite, my grandfather was the one who saw me. He encouraged my dreams, gave me advice, and supported me when no one else did. So when he passed away and left his entire estate to me, I was devastated by his loss. But I was also deeply touched that he had entrusted me with something so valuable. Unfortunately, my parents and Olivia saw it differently. The moment they found out, everything changed. At first, there was silence. My parents, who usually call me every week, suddenly had nothing to say. Olivia, who would send me texts asking for money or favors, went radio silent. I knew they were angry, but I hoped, foolishly, that they would get over it. Then, the passive-aggressive comments started. I'd get messages from extended family members asking why I was hoarding the inheritance when Olivia needed it more. At first, I tried to explain that it wasn't my decision. Grandpa had made his choice. But my parents didn't care. They started excluding me from family events, subtly at first, then blatantly. Christmas? I wasn't invited. Family barbecues? Somehow I was forgotten. Birthdays? They would celebrate without me. I was being punished for something I hadn't even done. But despite everything, I still loved my family. So when my father's birthday came around, I decided to be the bigger person. I bought a thoughtful gift, wrapped it nicely, and showed up to the celebration, hoping that this would be the moment we could move past the resentment. Instead, I walked into a war zone. From the second I arrived, I could feel the hostility in the air. My mother barely acknowledged me, and Olivia refused to make eye contact. Still, I swallowed my pride and handed my father his gift, forcing a smile. That was when he sneered and muttered, "Oh, so now you think money could buy back this family?" The room fell silent. My heart sank. Before I could even respond, my mother chimed in. "You took what should have been Olivia's, and now you have the audacity to show your face here?" It felt like a slap to the face. I had done nothing wrong. My grandfather made a decision, and yet, here I was being treated like a villain. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I didn't take anything. Grandpa made his choice. That was when Olivia finally spoke. Her voice was sharp with resentment. "You don't deserve it." Grandpa was old, maybe even confused. "If you had any decency, you'd share it with your family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It wasn't grief speaking. It was pure entitlement. Finally, my father snapped. If you're not going to do the right thing, then get out. That was it. The final straw. I left. But I wasn't just walking out of the party. I was walking away from all of them. For years, I had been helping Olivia behind the scenes. What no one knew, what she didn't even know, was that I had been quietly paying her rent. My grandfather had always worried about her irresponsibility, and after he passed, I wanted to make sure she was okay. But after what had just happened, that was over. That night, I canceled the payments. It didn't take long for Olivia to realize what had happened. 2 weeks later, I got a frantic phone call from her. She was panicking. Her rent was due, and without my help, she was screwed. I listened to her cry, begging me to reconsider, saying she was going to be evicted if I didn't step in. And for the first time in my life, I felt nothing. I simply said, "Figure it out." She called me heartless. My parents lashed out, furious that I had abandoned my sister. They even tried to guilt-trip me, saying that Olivia had no one else to turn to. But I was done being their safety net. What my parents hadn't expected was for other family members to find out the truth. At first, they had been spreading their own version of the story, making me look like the greedy villain who had stolen from Olivia. But when my extended family learned that I had been supporting her all along, and that my parents had thrown me out just for keeping what was rightfully mine, they turned against them. Relatives who had once sided with my parents began cutting them off, refusing to take their calls. The same family members who had judged me before were now openly criticizing them. And then came their last desperate attempt. A few months later, my parents suddenly reached out. It was the first time they had spoken to me since my father's birthday. Their message? "We're so sorry for everything. Can we please talk?" I should have known better, but some part of me still wanted to believe they had changed. So I agreed to meet. They put on the performance of a lifetime, tears, regret, and a sob story about how Olivia was on the verge of eviction and how they had made mistakes, but just needed my help one last time. Except they were lying. Before meeting them, I had already done my research. Olivia wasn't being evicted. She had moved back home with them. Their entire sob story was just a manipulative attempt to get me to reopen my wallet. And that was the moment I realized they never cared about me. They only cared about what I could give them. So I looked them in the eye and said, "I know you're lying." The color drained from my mother's face. My father stammered, trying to backtrack, but I didn't let them. "You didn't want me in this family? Well, congratulations. I'm gone." I walked away for good. Now, my parents are truly isolated. The last of their allies have abandoned them, and they have no one left to manipulate. Meanwhile, I'm living freely without their toxicity. I don't have to worry about Olivia's rent, my parents' guilt trips, or the weight of a family that only saw me as a bank account. Because in the end, I realized something important. Family isn't about blood. It's about who truly stands by you. And if they couldn't love me without my money, then they never loved me at all. Sometimes, walking away is the hardest thing to do. But when people show you their true colors, believe them. Because peace is worth more than any inheritance. Story 4. My husband and his family called me a freeloader while I secretly paid their bills. When I married Jake, I thought I was building a future with someone who loved and respected me. I never imagined that I would become the invisible provider, the unappreciated backbone of a family that saw me as nothing more than an outsider. Jake and I moved in with his mother, Anna, and his sister, Sophia, shortly after our wedding. I had my doubts, but Jake convinced me that it was temporary, just until his restaurant took off. I wanted to be a supportive wife, so I agreed. But from the start, his family made it clear I wasn't one of them. It started with little things. Anna would scoff at my cooking, telling me it wasn't the way Jake liked it. Sophia would point out the dust in the corners of the house, making passive-aggressive remarks about how I wasn't doing my part. If I spent a day resting, they'd make snide comments about how nice it must be to have so much free time. What they didn't know, what none of them cared to see, was that I was the only reason the household was still standing. Jake's restaurant wasn't making any money. He was barely bringing home anything, and what little he did make disappeared into keeping the business afloat. It was my income that covered the mortgage, my money that paid the electricity, the groceries, and all their little luxuries. And yet, they had the audacity to treat me like I was a burden. Even when I became pregnant with our son, nothing changed. If anything, their cruelty escalated. Anna constantly criticized my weight gain, laughing about how I was letting myself go. Sophia made it a game to point out every stretch mark, every swollen part of my body. Jake, he did nothing. He just sat there, letting them tear me down, letting them humiliate me in my own home while I paid for everything they had. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that once the baby came, Jake would step up, that things would get better. I was so wrong. After Sophia got married, she and her husband moved in with us. Suddenly, the house felt even smaller, the tension thicker. Then, one day, while I was out running errands with my son, I came home to find our belongings dumped on the front lawn. At first, I thought there had been a mistake. Maybe something happened. Maybe there was a flood or fire. But when I saw Anna and Sophia standing in the doorway, smirking, I knew the truth. They had thrown us out. Jake hadn't even warned me. When I called him, furious and demanding an explanation, he didn't even sound sorry. Sophia's pregnant. She and her husband need the space. You can figure something out. That was all he said. My husband, the man I had supported through everything, the man whose family I had carried on my back, had abandoned me and our son without a second thought. I was devastated. But what came next? That was what truly shattered me. A few days later, as I scrambled to find a new place for me and my son, I uncovered something I never expected. Jake had been cheating on me. While I was working long hours to keep his family's lights on, he had been taking another woman out on dates with my money. It was like a slap to the face. All those nights he had stayed late at the restaurant, he had been with her. Every time he had brushed me off when I wanted to talk, he had been texting her. And I had been paying for it all. I saw red. I wasted no time. I filed for divorce immediately. But I didn't stop there. I went through every single financial record and made a list of everything I had ever paid for in that house. And then I took it all back. The furniture? Gone. The appliances? Taken. Even the groceries and the fridge? Mine. Jake and his family had called me a freeloader while living off of me. So I gave them a taste of what life without me actually looked like. Without me funding their lifestyle, everything fell apart. Jake's restaurant collapsed within months. Without my income supplementing his losses, he couldn't keep it running. His mother and sister, the same women who had ridiculed me, were forced to cram into a tiny apartment with him. Meanwhile, I thrived. I took the pain, the betrayal, and turned it into motivation. I had always loved fitness, so I started working towards my passion, building my own successful fitness business. Now, I have my own home, my own money, and most importantly, a life free from their toxicity. Jake, he tried to reach out. He tried apologizing, begging me to take him back, saying he had made a mistake. I laughed in his face, because the real mistake was ever believing he and his family deserved me in the first place. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: never let anyone convince you that you owe them just because they share your last name or a wedding ring. I was the one who kept that family afloat. And the moment they thought they didn't need me anymore, they threw me away. But in the end, I won. Because while they're miserable and struggling, I'm free, thriving, and living my best life with my son. And that is the best revenge of all. Story 5. My ex-wife tried to manipulate the court for alimony, but got exposed. Divorces can be messy, but nothing prepares you for dealing with someone who sees marriage as a get-rich-quick scheme. That's exactly what happened when I divorced my ex-wife, Jessica. She wasn't just trying to move on. She was determined to bleed me dry. At first, I thought she was just bitter. We had problems in our marriage, sure, but I never expected her to drag things out for as long as possible, just to drain me financially. Every time we got close to finalizing the divorce, she found a new excuse, a new legal argument, a new demand. She wanted alimony. She acted like she was some helpless woman who had sacrificed everything for our marriage, when in reality, she had never worked a day in her life. Not because I asked her to stay home, but because she chose to sit around while I worked my ass off to support us. But her biggest stunt? That came at the final hearing. By this point, I was exhausted. I had spent months battling her ridiculous demands, paying for legal fees, and watching her play the victim. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. Jessica walked into the courtroom looking visibly pregnant. I swear, my jaw nearly hit the floor. She walked in slowly, holding her belly as if she were starring in some dramatic movie, making sure everyone could see she was expecting. Her message was clear. Your Honor, I'm a vulnerable pregnant woman. Please take pity on me. The judge's face showed concern. My lawyer glanced at me, as if to say, Are you seeing this? And Jessica? She sat down, placing a hand on her stomach for extra effect, waiting for the sympathy to roll in. She thought she had won. But what she didn't know, I already knew the baby wasn't mine. Jessica had underestimated me. She thought I was just going to accept whatever nonsense she pulled, but I had done my homework. Before this final hearing, I had hired a private investigator. Something in my gut told me she was up to something, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. What did my PI find? Medical records proving the conception date didn't match our marriage. Photos of Jessica with another man, out on dates, kissing, looking very much in love. The second my lawyer slid those documents across the table, I watched Jessica's smug smile disappear. The judge looked over the evidence carefully before raising an eyebrow. Mrs. Jessica, would you like to explain how you are demanding alimony from a man who is not the father of your child? Silence. Jessica froze. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her lawyer's face went pale. He knew. He knew she had played him, too. Then, like clockwork, she tried to play the victim. Your Honor, I was confused. My emotions were all over the place. I never meant to deceive anyone. But the judge wasn't buying it. The judge dismissed her alimony claim on the spot. Not only that, but he called out her behavior in front of the entire courtroom. This court does not take kindly to manipulation and deceit. You have wasted time and resources for your own financial gain. The case is closed. Jessica's face turned red. She tried one last plea, looking at me as if I was supposed to feel bad for her. But I just stood up, nodded at my lawyer, and walked out. Jessica had lost her last chance at scamming me. Her own lawyer looked defeated, like he was embarrassed to have represented her. And me? I was finally free. After that day, I did what I should have done long ago. I blocked her. Completely. No calls, no texts, no social media. Jessica tried playing the victim online, twisting the story to make it seem like I had abandoned her when she needed me most. But no one bought it. The truth was out there, and she had publicly humiliated herself in court. Meanwhile, I moved on, free from her drama, her lies, and her endless greed. And the best part? I never looked back.